Now, I'm going to introduce the next session. This is our final session of the day, other than my wrap up at the end, which I'm going to keep really short. I promise you that, as short as I can, and some thanks. But you're in the Public Sector and Civil Service Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Summit for 2021. Our theme today is Towards a Fairer Working World, and we come to the final session of the day, which is called How to Remove Barriers to Equality to Build a Fair and Equal Society. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Paul Deemer from NHS Employers, by Gisela Abbam from Perkin Elmer and the British Science Association, and by Annette Chandarana from Network Rail. The things that we're going to be looking at today under this topic are why are the barriers to equality in society? Why are they there? What's important to think about equality and how that has a direct link to social impact, and how do we overcome these barriers through real commitment and the implementation of good policies and procedures. So Paul, I'll just give you a bit more information about Paul's background. Paul's been an HR professional for over 30 years. He's worked in local government, the voluntary sector and the health service, and he has particular experience in the fields of recruitment, employee relations, employment law and diversity. He worked for Barnardo's and took on the role of National Equality and Diversity Manager, and then had a short spell as an HR lead in an NHS trust, and was then seconded into the Department of Health and Social Care's Equality and Diversity team to help develop the first national strategy in this area. Paul currently works for NHS Employers, which represents and supports NHS trusts across England, and is helping NHS organisations to embed diversity and inclusion good practice across the NHS. He also works on various diversity working groups and initiatives, including with the Chartered Institute of Linguistics and the Recruitment Industry Disability Initiative. And you can see Paul writing frequently about all aspects of diversity through various social media channels. Paul was honoured to be named in the 2020 People Management Diversity Power List. And then Gisela is a Senior Director for Government Affairs at Perkin Elmer. She was previously the inaugural Global Executive Director for Government Affairs and Policy for General Electric Healthcare, which is the $18 billion business unit of General Electric that provides transformational medical technologies to health customers in more than 100 countries. She's chair of the British Science Association and serves on various advisory committees, and is a commissioner for the National Preparedness Commission in the UK. Gisela has worked in conjunction with the WHO, World Health Organization, the World Bank and the UN to improve health outcomes globally, and is a global goodwill ambassador. And she was named in the 100 Women to Watch for FTSE 350 boards, and is winner of the 2019 Black British Business Person of the Year Award. She was awarded Iconic Woman Creating a Better World for All by the Women Economic Forum, and was awarded a Fellow of the Royal Society for Arts, Manufactures and Commerce for her contribution to social change. She's written more than 45 white papers on various public policy issues and regularly presents at international conferences. And we will be joined by Annette a little later. He's joining in about 10 minutes, so I'll introduce Annette when he joins. So we're talking here about barriers to equality in society. We're talking about the impact to think about on equality. And I thought we might start with Gisela, because you have an interesting perspective on this. You've got a lot of knowledge about the things you've seen, the policy aspects of that, the papers you've written, but you've also got your lived experience, haven't you, from time in local government and kind of the impact that had on you personally. So I'd like to, if it's all right with you, kick off, Gisela, if you'd like to share a little bit about your experiences and also what you've encountered around the barriers and how perhaps we can work to remove those.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here today, to be part of this really important conversation. Yes, indeed, barriers exist. And as a person of color, I have a lot of lived experience when I started my career journey working in local government, where I did an MBA and I was asked to help set up a working group because I did my dissertation on how we could improve social care for that local authority. And the directors loved the recommendations for my report and said, oh, we need to set up a working committee so we can use that for the implementation. So I was asked to chair the committee, and all the people I was working with were senior, and as a junior officer at the time. And we did it. I helped with the training, led everything, and they just wouldn't promote me. And I was just amazed at all the work I was doing, everything I'd done, and yet, and so for me, there was no other explanation apart from the fact that I was a different color to the rest of the people who I was working with. I had to come to the unfortunate conclusion that, that was the reason why I didn't get that promotion. And that went on, and I saw working in local authority, most of the junior officers were Black, people of color, and the senior management was different. And I remember there was one senior leader who was a person of color who I was really excited to see. And so I used to go and see her. She was in a different department. And one day she just said she's resigned because she's the only one at that level, and she unfortunately was struggling. And I didn't understand it at the time. And I was saying to myself, gosh, she had that position and then you're resigning. I mean, for goodness sake, was what I said to myself. Little did I know that I would be in the same situation later on. And it's like, we are alone at the top as a Black person, and it's even worse than being a junior person with a lot of Black people. Yes, you can mourn together, but you have that support, you have that sort of support group as well. And so those are the kind of barriers. And you wonder, looking back and just thinking about now and looking back why it happens, is it partly because we are seen as having a different color, so different values, different perspectives. That's part of the issue. It can also be, and I know we didn't discuss this before, it can also be the misconceptions from what you read in the media, because I remember very well, the media talked a lot, for example, of Black boys in hoods, that, they can attack you in the street. And I remember us coming home one day, and I saw some Black boys in hoods, and immediately I crossed the road scared. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm a Black person and I'm acting this way because I've seen it on the media so much that instinctively, without thinking, I crossed the road. You understand? And so that is part of what has caused some of this perception. Black people are not good enough in a job. They are not educated enough. They don't speak, some of them like me, we don't speak English the same way, and all sorts of reasons. Whereas when I worked in an American multinational company where the focus is on profit, there's less of an issue about bringing in people of color because it's about productivity, and that's the focus. So whether you're green, yellow, or red, if you can produce, then there's more openness. But then when you're talking about public sector, where we know it's about efficiency, but it's not about profits, there isn't that same drive, for people to open things up. But there have been enough studies that have been produced that actually state that when you have people of diversity in an organization, you improve productivity, and that is proven. And that productivity means that you have new ideas, you have new ways of innovating, you have new ways of improving, because people are coming from different perspectives. So I think that's part of the issue, because when people who have traveled, especially white people have traveled, you realize they're more open, they're more understanding, they're more embracing. So I think it's almost like it's a fear. People think the fear of unknown. So if it's not known to me, it means it's not right, it's not good, it's not acceptable. And that's what we need to break. And I think, and I'll just give one solution. I think one solution is not just we of people sitting together to discuss it. Actually, we need a whole of society engagement and approach to discussing this issue, to try and solve it, to find out why on both sides is there an issue, and what can we do to move it forward.
And thank you, Gisela, for not only highlighting some of the kind of systemic reasons around these things, but actually sharing your lived experience and having the generosity and the courage to do that. It's not easy to face up to the fact that you've encountered these barriers, and as you said, the irony that you ended up in the position of the very person you were wondering why would they leave, and then you experienced that yourself. And that, I guess from my perspective as a white person, I'm conscious of the huge importance of understanding what it feels like to be a person of color, or to be a person with a disability, to experience something that makes you feel excluded, or forgotten, or that you don't belong. And, for me, the light bulb moment came because as a person who's steeped in diversity and inclusion, as a practitioner of it, you fall into the trap of thinking, yes, I get it, I understand that. I've been to enough conferences, I've heard enough things. But until you experience it in your body, it never really lands fully. And so some years back, I attended a Black Entrepreneurs Conference in London, and I was basically the only white person in a room of several hundred Black people. And I think it's the first time I'd ever been in that situation. And it was very confronting. I felt, I don't belong here. Now, I was obviously welcome there, but I had this bodily reaction saying I shouldn't be in this space. And then I think, well, if you're the only Black senior leader in an organization, or the only Black person at all, and you walk into a meeting room, and of the 20 people in the room, you're the only Black one, that must be your daily experience. And so I felt that was a really anchoring moment for me to understand some of the barriers to equality. Now, you'll notice that this session is very ambitious, because we're trying to address barriers to equality to build a fair and equal society, not just a workplace. This session today, often it's been focused on the workplace, but Paul and Gisela, you've got the privilege of being able to sort of spread this out wider to society more generally. And we're going to come to Paul in a moment, because I know that with the NHS, you have an enormous employer. You might give us some of the stats around the size of the NHS just to remind everyone, put it in perspective. But I think also, Gisela, what I'm aware of on the anecdote you shared is that, and we had a session on data earlier today, how to use data. I suspect that, at local government level some time ago, you might have looked at those numbers and said, but we've got a lot of Black employees. We're doing really well. But it wasn't until you said, but how senior are they, that the true position would emerge, would it? That you could see, well, actually, there are very, very few, maybe one, maybe none. So unpacking that's really important. So, Paul, if I could come to you and perhaps set the scene for what you do and where you work in terms of the NHS, and then kind of, I suppose, how does that play out for you in terms of the power of the NHS and what kind of responsibilities you have for helping to tackle barriers and for helping to create a fairer society?
Okay, thank you, David. I'm glad you've given us an easy subject to finish the day with. So Gisela and I are going to change society in the next 30 minutes, perhaps. It's quite ambitious, but on a serious level, working for the NHS, it's a privilege. It's a big responsibility as well, and it's a big responsibility because, as David said, we're a big employer. So we are the 5th largest employer in the world, the largest employer in Europe, and obviously in the UK as well. We employ 1.4, 1.5 million staff overall. And we have a great deal of spending power as well as an organisation. And I think that's where the societal aspect comes into it. So this really, for me, it plays into that whole corporate social responsibility thing that we talk about as organisations. And that's something that we as the largest public sector body in the UK have to take seriously. So, we have duties under the Equality Act, as all public sector bodies do. And we have a duty to promote and support equality and tackle discrimination and tackle disadvantage. And we will do that, and we try to do that, and everything in our policies and practices is geared towards trying to reduce inequalities not just in our workforce, but also in health inequalities as well, which, we'll no doubt perhaps talk about a little bit later in terms of the amplification of that during the pandemic period. But when we've got that responsibility and then we commission services, for example, from a cleaning firm or a catering firm or any other organisation, those duties are then bestowed upon that organisation as well. So they carry those duties as well. So, we have policies and practices which they have to adhere to as well. So that's where the social responsibility comes in, I think, for us as an organisation, and we take that very seriously.
And you've reminded us, Paul, there of the importance of procurement, because it kind of undoes all your good work, doesn't it? If you, as an organisation at your core, are doing all the right things, but then in your procurement, you sort of forget all about that. And then suddenly it turns out, well, actually we're using suppliers, or we've got contractors who don't live by those standards, and they don't kind of reflect what you talked about there, Paul, in terms of responsibility to society, just through your sheer size, the number of people you employ, the amount of money you have available to spend. And, there's all sorts of anecdotes about, there's one a few years back of a professional services firm with front desk staff who sent one of the client-facing front desk people home because she was not wearing high heels. This professional services firm did not have a dress code that required women to wear high heels, but the contractor did. And they thought it was appropriate to send someone home because they weren't dressed in high heels, which, you don't need to be wearing high heels to do your job, to greet clients. So their hard work at being an inclusive employer was brought undone, and it was splashed all over the media. Now, Annette, you've arrived just in time, because I'm going to throw to you in a moment, but welcome. I thought it was ironic that in a session that was all about data and technology, you had trouble with technology this morning. And thank you, Paul and Gisela, for so generously allowing Annette to join this session, somewhat unexpectedly, but very, very welcome. And if it's all okay with everyone, I just thought it'd be nice to introduce Annette properly. So Annette's Chief of Staff at Network Rail, where his prime role is lending strategic support to the CEO and ensuring the smooth running of the CEO's office. And is the most senior minority ethnic member of staff at National Rail, where he also co-sponsors the staff race network, Central Cultural Fusion. And I guess there's a play on words there, isn't there? Something to do with Network Rail and fusing rails together or something like that, but I thought it was a cool name. And it's a qualified accountant who joined Network Rail in 2003 after completing training at Sainsbury's and then a further 5 years at Shell. But interestingly, he took a break from 2005 to 2007 to run a food supply business, which grew to £2 million turnover. And outside his day role, Annette is a non-executive director for East London NHS Foundation Trust, where he chairs the audit committee. So the little bit you missed, Annette, before you joined with Paul and Gisela, we were just sort of talking about this question of lived experience in encountering barriers in the workplace, and Gisela very generously shared her experience of having done some really amazing work in local government and being kind of on the one hand recognised for that, but then not promoted, and watching this cycle of non-promotion and then sort of realising the impact that can have when it's actually, the conclusion is it's my skin colour that's holding me back. But I know, and you've got some interesting insights around kind of the work that's being done at Network Rail, talking to colleagues and using data to understand the barriers and maybe how you can remove those barriers. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what you've been doing at Network Rail?
Yeah, no, of course. And thank you, Gisela and Paul, for allowing me to join the call, and really good to be here. So taking that specific cue, David, so we are an organisation that absolutely would say we encourage full inclusion of all communities within our business. And we thought we were doing pretty well until about this time last year. We really looked at the data in a way that we had never looked at before. So beyond, the kind of normal data and statistics of what proportions we had in our business. And to just give you two examples of of what the data told us. Unequivocally, the data told us that people of ethnic minority background, particularly people of black background, had worse outcomes in our performance review processes beyond the kind of boundaries of what you might say is normal variation, statistically significantly so. And the other, another example was whilst people of ethnic minorities were actually applying for more internal roles as the funnel into the process, they were less successful coming out of it. So they were less successful in the final recruitment decisions. And the difference here is what that really did for us was take away false hope that we were better than we were, and it really put data at the heart of that that position, so nobody could deny that, and it was a really uncomfortable piece to see. It really kick-started a conversation where people had to take their head out of the sand because you couldn't refute it, because the data absolutely showed you where we were going. And just to give you a kind of flavour of background, what size of organisation is Network Rail? We have 40,000 employees in total, so we're nowhere near as big as the NHS in total, Paul, compared to numbers you were saying earlier, but still 40,000 people, of which we have a broad 1/3, 2/3 split of what you might call frontline workers. So the people you see in orange delivering projects, working in stations, is about of that 40,000, about 30,000, and the rest are what you might call kind of office-based staff. And the other thing that was true was the data was pretty consistent across all those groups. So it wasn't like we had a problem just in our front line or just in our office-based locations. And David, I think the real powerful nature of that was an undeniable problem that nobody could hide away from. And we and I used it very specifically, first of all, to bring the executive of Network Rail to account for what those stats were saying. And of course, nobody who was on the exec was in a position where they would knowingly have wanted to be leading an organisation like that. But it was too easy before then to hope that our organisation wasn't like that.
And I mean, we had this conversation earlier today around data and the importance of using the data, understanding what the data is telling you, and comparing different sets of data to get a full picture. And I love the honesty and of sharing, that you've given us around saying, well, sometimes when you confront the data, it's very uncomfortable and it tells a story that you'd rather not hear, because the next obvious question is, well, what are you going to do about that? And perhaps, we're talking about removing barriers to equality to build a fairer society, but, businesses, the public sector, the civil service, NHS, all play a practical role in that, don't they? Because the reality is that where you experience a lot of those barriers is in the workplace. So to be able to highlight those and shine a light on them through the use of data like that is really important. We did also talk, just so that you're aware, Annette, of one of the observations we made is that the data is only as good as what you can get from what people disclose. And I know, Gisela, you'll be aware of this as well, is that there are sensitivities around, there are gaps in the data we have when we ask people to self-disclose elements of diversity, whether it's disability, race, and so on. And so it can be really challenging, can't it? Particularly when you split that data down to very small teams, where then anonymity, privacy become an issue. And so that's one of the evergreen challenges that is in there when you're at a sort of line manager level of like, well, at a certain point, you need to let go of the data, don't you? And just look at what's happening in front of you. What do I see in my team day to day? I don't need data to tell me this. I ought to be able to see this with my own eyes. But as you get higher up, obviously, you don't physically get to see people and you need to rely on that data. Now, you've got an interesting challenge, Annette, that I want to come back to later. So I'm just going to plant the seed of this one in case Paul and Gisela want to contribute to it as well, because I know we didn't really discuss this when we were preparing for this session, but around kind of maybe businesses ought to stop talking about the business case for diversity and instead focus on the moral imperative. So I'm just going to plant that one there. But what I'd like to do now is come back to something Paul mentioned around sort of the role of the NHS and people's health. But we've been living through a major pandemic, the biggest one that I can remember in my lifetime. That's for sure. And there was we had a little bit of discussion about this, Annette, this morning, but you raised a really interesting anecdote around the impact of COVID on different ethnic groups in East London. And I wondered whether you could just share that insight that you had. And then Paul, I don't know whether this is something you've come across, but once Annette shared his anecdote, you might want to see whether you've got any observations on that.
And I suspect it might have been something similar to what Paul was referring to earlier in his earlier response. But I think most people will be aware that there was quite early on during the pandemic a recognition that ethnic minority populations had higher rates of in certain locations had higher rates of infection, and there was I think a really unfortunate positioning beginning to take form in some popular media circles that this was potentially a genetic issue, something that meant that people with ethnic minorities were more susceptible to the COVID variants and the COVID virus. And it's true to say that East London, which is where I work as a non-exec, was one area where we did see higher rates of infection, and we did also see higher rates of infection amongst people of different ethnic minorities. But actually, from our perspective, it became clear that that was more about the inequalities we had in society in how in the kinds of jobs people of ethnic minorities did, which tended to be jobs which meant they couldn't isolate, that they were out more often, but also that that they tended to live in areas of poorer housing, tended to live in areas which had more overcrowding. And so it was more a circumstance of where those minority groups were. And actually what we found was, when we looked at the data, that in those locations, it wasn't COVID, unsurprisingly, wasn't particularly discriminatory. It was affecting populations equally. It's just those areas tended to have higher ethnic minority backgrounds. So it was this kind of early implication that it was genetic or some kind of something in the way the virus worked, whereas actually it was a demonstration of some of the inequalities we have in society, quite naturally in the way things have fallen.
And Marcus this morning made the point that people of minority ethnic background are overrepresented in the frontline jobs that put them most at risk of being exposed to COVID, like driving transport, frontline health workers, and so on. Paul, did you want to add any thoughts to that that kind of anecdote that Annette shared?
No, I mean, I can't disagree with anything Annette said, because, and actually it's quite difficult for me to go back to that time, because it was a really hard time, actually, because we were living through that literally day by day, hour by hour. Because if you think about the intensity at that time that you're talking about, Annette, back in March, April last year, I mean, it was just relentless. It was absolutely relentless, and we were, and the reason I find it difficult is because the reason that that it started to hit people was because we were seeing pictures on the news, as we all were. If you remember, they were actually showing pictures of doctors who had died, and which goes to your point, David, about frontline workers, and there was one night the news came on and there was a picture of all the people who died, and it was just dominated by black and brown faces, and that was when, for a lot of people actually in senior positions within the NHS, the light bulb came on, and we actually saw that. Interestingly, as well, the other avenue through which the disproportionate impact came to our attention, NHS employers, was because, and this is all about unintended consequences actually of these things, was we actually started to get calls around April time from staff within hospitals, because if you remember, we were closing down hospitals at that time for all the right reasons. But as part of that closure, we were also closing down rooms like chaplaincies and faith rooms within hospitals. So we had this huge number of calls coming through to us from staff, because it was towards the time when Eid was coming up. And we had calls from staff saying, well, where are we supposed to go to practice our, and even from, other staff who had from other faiths, where are we supposed to go, to, sort of show our solace and, and where are we supposed to, sort of share our grief, etc. Because these rooms were being closed down, because we were all worried about the transfer of the virus, etc., etc. So, yeah, absolutely. It was a terrible time. It was an awful time. It was a very, very hard lesson. But I think, Annette, now we've worked, as you know, we've worked through that. But using the data, so Public Health England have been fantastic in that respect. I mean, the quality of the data has been great. But what it allowed us to do was to just step back and take an objective look and make, and make some evidence-based decisions about where policy needed to go. And I think hopefully we've gone in the right direction eventually. Yeah. I mean, I won't, we all know it wasn't perfect, but you've got to remember the pace that we were working at that time. And, the uniqueness of that situation we were going through. Yeah.
I mean, Gisela will come to you in 2 seconds, but you're right to say that, look, in those very uncertain times, it's incredibly challenging, isn't it? Events are unfolding rapidly, people are demanding responses, different stakeholder groups, and there is always that risk, isn't there, in human nature, that in a time of threat, in a time of stress, that people will scapegoat, or the burden will fall disproportionately on those who are least able to manage their way through. I don't have access to a helicopter to fly off to an island and stay away from COVID. We're all stuck here. Gisela.
Right. So I just wanted to contribute to this discussion because I was part of a working group which had been set up by the government to feedback on race and issues, and COVID came up. And one of the things that I flagged was in America, a lot of the Black community, we found out the reason why Black people were getting sick was because of lack of vitamin D. And if you realize, if you speak to GPs individually, literally, they have all seen Black people or people of color, and actually Asian as well, who have had severe immune defects because they lack vitamin D during the winter months. But because that data wasn't collected together centrally in a central pool, the NHS didn't know to respond and start saying straight away, people of color start taking vitamin D because that will help to build your immune system. So people got really ill very quickly. So it was within the Black communities, I mean, I'm saying that because I'm a Black person, that we heard about it. So we all started buying vitamin D to dose up and build that. And so that has been the challenge as well. How do we use data that is for particular groups and collate that and then use to then give advice as well? And so I think that's something that should be taken note of. Thank you.
And Gisela, that reminds me when you and I and Paul had a chat a little while back, Paul made a statement, something along the lines of, there is a power in data and monitoring, but it relies on what you choose to look at. So if you're looking at the wrong things, or you're not looking at certain things, then you'll miss them, won't you? And you won't pick up, as you said, well, there are patterns emerging here. And I guess the people who get to choose what we look at are usually the people who've got the power and the influence and the privilege. In the discussion we've had so far, it's occurred to me that we're sometimes operating at the far end of a long chain of barriers that have been in place that don't just arise when you get sick with COVID in East London, or they don't just arise when you turn up and you try to get a promotion in local government, and they don't just turn up when you show up at the NHS and you need treatment. They start earlier than that. They start in secondary school, they start in primary school, they start before you go to school. They start with your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents, and there's a long, long chain stretching back. So if we're hoping to, if our ambition is to address and remove barriers to equality and build a fair society, then in fairness, we have to look at those things, don't we? And, you know, I wonder, Gisela, you had mentioned the experience your daughter has had at school, for example, and what that means about what teachers need to understand. And I wonder if you wanted to just talk a little bit about that, and then maybe share some of your experience around, you know, where you've seen candidates who've come forward who are actually really well qualified, but then have encountered barriers around how they're perceived as a candidate.
Yes, indeed. So it's a shame that unfortunately discrimination happens at the school system level. And unfortunate to say this, that by a lot of teachers, a number of teachers as well. I'm really sorry that I have to say that, but unfortunately that is the case. And so when, for example, the GCSEs were cancelled last year and teachers had to then award grades, you realize that in some schools, because they had to have a balance of the number of students who had particular grades, some students were given lower grades who were Black children, for example, people of color. My daughter had that experience as well, even though her grades were higher. And so facing that kind of discrimination as a Black person has been a big challenge as well. And it happens in all kinds of schools. She's in a private boarding school where I'm paying a lot of fees. And the same thing happens, and I talk to people in the state system, the same thing happens as well. And when you're in a school where majority of the students are white, unfortunately, that's what happens. And so it goes back to your point exactly. It needs to be embedded in teacher training. It needs to be a system that picks up on this. I mean, it's just, I don't understand it as well, why that should happen, why it's so difficult for people to treat everyone the same way. But obviously we've discussed that, and it's just that hidden biases that happen. So yeah, so that's what's happened with my daughter, it's happened with my niece, it's happened with French children, the same kind of issue in different schools where they are picked on for all sorts of things. And it's a shame when it happens with teachers, because they are the ones who have the power. If it's with students, you know, it's easier to deal with. And that's the challenge that we have to look at. I think there was another point you wanted me to cover.
It was around, you know, have you seen examples of candidates who've come forward with CV and then been told, I'm sorry, you're not good enough?
Yes. So there've been examples. Was one place I worked, which I won't say, where there were never any people of color shortlisted. And I said to the HR that actually I want to look at some, CVs and interview some people, because I can't believe that, if we're doing graduate recruitment, we won't have anyone of color, applying at all. And so they got some CVs together and gave one and said, and there was one that I particularly liked. And they said, oh, we don't think the person is good enough. And I said, but the person has a first class, and you have shortlisted people who have had 2-1 because, and the only thing I can think about is because they are white. So what is the difference in terms of what this person has? Because they all don't have much work experience. They've all just finished university and they had no answer. So that's the kind of bias, that happens in terms of shortlisting as well, because, we discussed that people look for people who they feel are similar to them, even when they're recruiting. So that bias is then sometimes people don't realize it. We're forgetting that actually, if you have a variety of candidates and you have people with different skill set, it actually enriches the organization, and it actually can help the organization to move forward and think about things from different perspectives. And I think that's why I've always said that if even I'm a board meeting and everyone says yay and one person says no, I don't necessarily assume that the person who said no is wrong because everyone else is saying yes. I have to understand why is it that you're saying no and what perspective you are looking at it, for us to then decide whether actually that is a really valuable point. And that's the challenge. I think we all want things to be easier in life and just sweep things under the carpets, but it's important for us as human beings and really to break these barriers, to be able to live peacefully with everyone and share and listen to everyone and treat everyone similarly.
And, you know, Gisela, when we were talking, and Meenakshi was part of this conversation, but that it's, you know, it's often been left to people of colour to educate white people about their experience and bias. Whereas maybe now it's time for white people to start educating themselves. And Meenakshi shared this anecdote about Lord Ganesh, who is the elephant-headed deity who has a small mouth and big ears because he listens more than he speaks. And there's an invitation there for us, particularly as white people, to do the listening and do the learning and educate ourselves rather than rely on black people to have to put in that emotional labour. And you've got a fan, Gisela. Anne Mwangi has put a comment here saying, you know, Gisela absolutely can identify with what you said about your personal experience. When people get to know you as a person, as a fellow human being, it can help to overcome stereotypes. And I was wondering, actually, I was going to ask Paul about this because I know that you said you'd been involved in going into schools to educate people about what the NHS does. You know, why do you think it's important to connect with people in schools, and how does that help to address barriers and then to sort of ultimately to create a fairer society?
Just for all the reasons that Gisela's outlined, really, you know, the importance of education. And, you know, that's about self-education as well. You know, I think leaders, you know, senior people within organizations have a responsibility as well to educate themselves. It shouldn't fall, as you say, to the black person in the room, the gay person in the room, the women, you know, to help other people to understand. You've got to educate yourself. And that goes for all of us. You know, none of us are without bias. We all carry natural biases. And the critical thing for me is around self-awareness. Which again goes back, I thought Gisela's example was a great one, because the other thing you're outlining there, I think as well, is the danger of groupthink, you know, which is something that, you know, we saw, you know, the classic example of that was during the great financial crash of recent years, where you had all these men sitting around in boardrooms in big financial institutions, and it was predominantly men. I suspect it was predominantly white men as well, actually. They were all sitting around making these decisions and, you know, all agreeing with each other, actually. And that's dangerous. And that's dangerous in any situation, whether it's a financial boardroom or a healthcare boardroom as well, where you're making decisions about patients' lives. You know, so I think it was a very good example. And that's why we do not, I've done it, but actually a lot of our careers people within the NHS spend a lot of time going into schools, talking to children, and talking about, you know, the type of environment that we want them to come into, and that we want them to actually come in and contribute as well to change within our organisation. We want the young people to come in and bring, you know, that reality into the workplace, of, you know, what's happening in their world at the moment, and how do we need to adjust our workplaces to reflect that.
And I guess what we're doing really is unlocking the power of allies from as early an age as we can, yeah? Because one of the models is, okay, it takes one brave woman to refuse to sit at the back of the bus, and then you get change. But wouldn't it be great if there were allies there, you know, backing up and making that possible, rather than, you know, being left to one lone person to have to stand up, to be the one lone voice in the board meeting who disagrees. And I guess there's a famous clip from Yes Minister, you might remember from years back, where they're all sitting around the cabinet table discussing, the civil service heads are all sitting around discussing the importance of, including women and having plenty of women represented in the civil service. But of course, each one of them then went on to say, well, but of course, in my department, that wouldn't be possible. I mean, I can't have a woman going into a meeting with a trade unionist. And of course, in my department, well, I'm defence, women can't go off to war. And as you go around the table, every single man, having just agreed how important it was, then says, yeah, but not in my department. So there's still echoes of that, isn't there? There are ghosts of that ringing throughout some of our organisations. I'm going to give Anna a chance now to address this interesting viewpoint he has, and then we're going to close out the summit. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to come back to Paul, Gisela, and then Annette to provide one final thought. It could be an action point that our delegates could take away, or you may want to challenge them or leave them with a question to ponder. So while Annette is sharing his viewpoint on why businesses should stop talking about the business case for diversity, have a bit of a think about that.
Thanks, David. And actually, both Paul and Gisela have touched on this in their earlier comments, so it fits quite nicely. So I used to be one of these people that talked about the business case for diversity. It meant businesses made better decisions and so on. And I still believe that, but that's not the reason why we should be promoting inclusivity, because it implies there's choice. Implies that if there wasn't a business case, then maybe we should choose not to be inclusive. And actually, it is for me, it's a moral imperative that as we sit around this virtual table that we're on, there's no reason why myself or Gisela should have views that are any less well regarded than the ones David and Paul you are having. And thankfully, that's come across loud and clear through the way that we've carried the conversation. If I have views that don't make sense or are not relevant, that's not because of my race or background. That's because I'm not. That's because of who I am as an individual internally. I was on a similar one of these a few months ago, and one of the statements that was made when I said this, rather controversially, was in support of what I'm saying was, if you always listen to the business case. Lots of people would claim that slavery had a good business case, but none of us now in this day and age would sit here and say that that was the right thing. And I'm not suggesting that's right, but it's an interesting perspective that business case implies choice, and there just is no choice in this matter.
Well, I think that's it's a thought-provoking and stimulating viewpoint, and I think few would disagree that. With that proposition, I guess for me, I've always looked at the business case and thought it's relevant when you're deciding whether to buy a new fleet of photocopiers. But I don't see the relevance of business case for many of the things that we're trying to achieve in inclusion and diversity, not least which is that business cases often turn very narrowly on kind of costs, don't they? Is the return on the cost there? And I think my perspective has always been that diversity and inclusion is an investment. It's not a cost, but it's also a necessity because you can't. And we've heard this throughout the entire summit. We just had a very rich discussion with Colonel Lucy Giles, who gave some really practical examples of how actually the army and the military is much more effective now. Because it's more inclusive, because it's got women doing jobs that previously it would have made it very hard for the army to have the impact it's got. Not least, and one of the examples she cited was working in a country like Mali. If you're trying to gather intelligence and you don't have women available in your force, they can't interact with the local women. It's a Muslim country. Men would not be able to have that interaction with women. And so that's just a really basic thing. So, and you could call that business case, you could call it moral case, but I think what we're all touching on, aren't we, is that there's something about the values, there's something about what it is to be a human being. Absolutely. There's something about fairness and equality in here that you just trying to put a price on a human life is something that you do when you're an actuary for an insurance company, but it's not really what you should be doing when you're the CEO is it? You're not really trying to value your people according to dollars and pound signs. And I think some of the barriers that you've highlighted here that have struck me, Gisela, you've talked about the practical effect of going to school and finding out that the way you're perceived in terms of your performance at school has been affected by your skin color. The way your CV is perceived when it comes to hiring or promotion is affected by skin color. Paul, you've talked about, access to healthcare, about the impact and responsibility of a large employer to use that power to overcome some of those barriers. And you've got a tremendous power as a procurer through the education and training you do, that influence of using that and using data to understand what's going on. And of course, Anna, you've highlighted some of the barriers that come up. Dare we say the media plays a role in those, in fomenting stereotypes, in creating things that are not founded on fact and data, but are really emerging from an uncertain environment where people revert to stereotypes. And then the media plays a role in generating those. All of these barriers form a kind of backdrop, don't they, to the lived experience of people. So I really appreciate that we've been able to unpack, to some degree, it's a very complex topic. Obviously, in the space of an hour, we can't do justice entirely to it. And I'm not sure that any of us would walk away from here thinking that we'd suddenly found the solution to building a fair and equal society. But in the closing moments of this session, I want to invite each of you to share your final reflections and perhaps a takeaway that our delegates could put into action, or a question that they could ponder. So I might start off with Annette, if that's all right, and I'll work my way around to Gisela and then Paul.
So David, I think if I was to have one ask of our delegates that are on here today, would be take a long, honest, hard look at the organisations that you represent, not from fear, but from the good place that actually, starting with knowing what you're dealing with, actually gives you the best opportunity to deal with that. And there are reasons to be hopeful. We can make a difference if we put our mind to it. So understand what your organisations are and think hard about what you want to do to make a difference.
Great, thank you, Anna. Gisela.
Thank you so much. I think it's important for white people, to be able to reach out and get to know their Black colleagues informally, especially if you're in management positions. And if you see any act of racism or discrimination, have the courage to call it out. Because unless we start, because we have some great allies, all my mentors career-wise have been white people who have helped me so much and opened lots of doors for me. So this is not about the fact that all, different colors are not helping. There are others there, but unfortunately the system is still, skewed towards obviously discriminating people of color. So we need more advocates to come out and step out and really call it out. And I think it's important that, there are discussions, bringing both sides together, those who are being discriminated against those who are not being discriminated, to really have a discussion and see how can we move forward and improve things. And then for the school system, I would just say, frankly, if there's anyone in the school system here, if that's happening at that level, there has to be some repercussions, in terms of schools that, you have to call out, we have to be able to call out the teachers and get some action taken against them, so that maybe that will deter them from doing that to students, because students are younger, they are more vulnerable, they can't stand up for themselves. Even as in workplaces, we struggle. So I think that's also another area that we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul.
Thanks, David. Just to build a bit really on what Gisela said, I think that you're right. People need to look to themselves. I think Annette said that as well. Look at yourself. And I think one of the best learning experiences, David, you talked about it, I think in your example you gave about attending a Black Workers Conference. And I think I would encourage people to go along to your Black Workers Network within your organisation. Lots of organisations have Black Workers Networks, or a Disabled Staff Network within your organisation, a Women's Network, LGBT network. go along to one of those meetings, put yourself in that uncomfortable position of being the minority in the room. If you haven't had that experience, it's quite an experience. I think it will help you in terms of that self-reflection.
And we've had a couple of comments come in as well. So Anne points out, Anne Mwangi says, there's research that shows that Black and minority ethnic pupils perform better when their grades are externally assessed rather than by their teachers. And that's a concern, isn't it? I mean, it goes to the point of what Gisela is saying, that there's something systemic in there about the way those assessments are done when they're carried out by teachers. And also says Black parents I know have been concerned about teacher assessments during COVID-19. COVID seems to have been this thing that's lifted the lid on a whole lot of stuff, hasn't it? It's sort of opened up Pandora's box in many ways. Neil also points out, Neil Ryder, who was one of our speakers earlier today, he points out that the FDA has provided training for BAME staff, working with CS Employee Diversity Networks, where we offer the same training available to all, but exclusively for BAME staff on that occasion. So it's kind of allowing Black and minority ethnic staff to come together and have a space. And the purpose is to avoid some of the issues around release that seem to affect Black and minority colleagues disproportionately. There's an employer willingness now to accept that there is an issue and try to do something which is encouraging. But actually, Neil says we've been doing this for over 10 years now. And of course, reference has been made to the role and power of diversity network groups and how you can use them to educate yourself. Thanks again to Paul and Gisela in particular for graciously and kindly allowing Annette to join as a welcome but unexpected guest. It's been great to have your participation. I'm really glad that we managed to find a way to get you in. Again, slight irony there that the sort of data and tech side of things affected one of our speakers on that panel. It's a bit like what I've noticed about communications people within organizations. If you work in the comms team, why is it that it's always impossible to get hold of the person in comms? You know, their Outlook email box is always full, their phone is full of messages, and you can never get them. So anyway, something in there for all of us to reflect on. So I'm going to thank my panel of guests, Gisela, Paul and Annette. Thank you so much for closing out today's session. I'm going to make a few closing remarks before I end the summit officially, but I would like to thank you all and wish you well. And I'm going to allow you to exit off the stage.